Welcome to the Learning Curve. Today, Sanjay Srivastava, CEO of Vocareum, is joined by Michael Horn, co-author of Disrupting Class, and together they revisit the theory of disruptive innovation nearly 2 decades later, exploring why it stalled in K-12 and what Vocareum's own research at UC San Diego found when AI met the classroom.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm Sanjay Srivastava, the host of The Learning Curve, and I'm also the CEO of Vocareum. My guest today is Michael Horn. In 2008, Michael Horn co-authored a book with Clayton Christensen and Curtis Johnson called Disrupting Class. It took the theory of disruptive innovation, the idea that had already explained why great companies fail, and turned it on to something far more consequential, our schools. It became one of the most influential books written about education in this century, and it has been argued about ever since. Michael went on to co-found the Clayton Christensen Institute. He teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's written 8 books, including Blended, Choosing College, From Reopen to Reinvent, and most recently, the bestseller Job Moves. He co-hosts Class Disrupted and Future You, and writes The Future of Education. He was in the front of Congress just weeks ago, testifying on AI in higher education, and hopefully we get to talk about a little bit that testimony. And he has spent 20 years doing something rare, publicly examine how his own theory has worked out, and hope to discuss that. Michael, welcome to the Learning Curve.
You and I have obviously known each other for over a decade, I think, at this point. I was reflecting on that when we met at UVA years ago. So it's great to see you having become an entrepreneur in this space, not just in others now as well. So love it.
Yeah, and the reason, of course, the UVA meeting, I remember that too. And just to give you a context why I was excited about it, because just a little bit about myself. I started my first company in 1995, in 3 or 4 years after graduation in Silicon Valley. And I decided to bootstrap the company. And I was trying to read everything I could to see how I was an engineer. And so, in those days, I remember the books like Crossing the Chasm or the Good to Great and Regis McKenna's book, Relationship Marketing. But, 1997, I think that was the year the innovator's dilemma hit. And, it was really, really big deal because especially as a bootstrap company, it gave me a language to talk about how to view the world. Where do you think this disruption is going to be sustaining, versus there's an opportunity for me to get in and talk about languages like unserved market. So it was a big deal. Then, of course, what blends in my mind, not only the innovator's dilemma, but the innovator's solution, right? I think that was the second book. But when you and Clay wrote this book, Disruptive Class, that was a big deal for me personally, because, theory I was familiar with is I was trying to get into the education space, and I thought it was giving me some language and context I was sort of already familiar with. So it's really, really awesome to have you here on this podcast. So just to get going, for people who don't know, go back from Christian's original thesis around innovator solution, a dilemma and innovator solution, and then how you guys applied it to disruptive class.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. A lot of people say, oh, underserved customers need disruptive innovation. You're like, no. They want more stuff. They want the sustaining innovations. It's truly those that do not have access to existing leading companies' products, services at the time. Disruptive innovations come in with something powered by a new technology that's more primitive, simpler, easy to use, more affordable, takes root with them, and then it starts to get better and better. And people who are using the traditional products or services of the market, as it gets better, they start to move out to the disruptive innovation one by one. They're delighted with something that's good enough now, but it's also more affordable, simple, accessible, and so forth. And so this is how computing changed, automobiles, retail. You can tell the story in product industries, service industries, and the like. And what we tried to do in education was figure out, it's clear our public schools in the United States were stuck with I would call it a factory model, monolithic model, batching kids by age, delivering content to them, and then sending them out the other side. And being surprised that, some percentage of them got it, huge percentage didn't really, and some percentage didn't at all. When in fact, of course, that's how it happens, because learning is extremely jagged. It's not linear. We move at different paces. We have different background experiences. And so the question was, could we use this sort of body of innovation theory to help schools get a little unstuck? And what I would tell you is, the first thing you see is, at least in the United States, there's no unserved students. And we tried to get a little creative and say, okay, well, maybe the disruptive innovation occurs within schools of how the classroom operates. And there's lots of non-consumption or unserved right? There's the advanced classes that schools can't offer, or credit recovery, or things of that nature. And I think what you see is online learning, digital learning was coming up at the same time. That felt like a viable technology enabler. And it did take off in line with disruptive innovations, but because it was still within the traditional system of schooling, it did not create the personalization and mastery-based learning that we had hoped for and argued for in the book. Because at the end of the day, the metrics, if you will, that it was judged by were still seat time, that process of did you cover the material, send them out regardless of how much they mastered and so forth. So in many ways, we got a disruptive innovation that got crammed into the schooling model we had argued about. And it hasn't produced great outcomes as a result, I would argue. Clearly digital disrupted analog in terms of delivery, but not the gains that we wanted. Now, I will tell you there's another chance in K-12 education, I think, for this maybe to come out differently at the moment. And that's purely because we're seeing a bunch of states offer these education savings accounts where they'll actually now pay families to choose different schools, different educational models, tutoring, et cetera. And all of a sudden that quote unquote free public school maybe looks a little less free than it used to when you're forsaking some numbers of thousands of dollars from the state. We'll see. We don't know yet, but it's possible that there's actually a market forming that could be more in line with Christensen's earlier studies. But that lack of non-consumption, that lack of unserved students, that really was the thing that I think more than anything gummed up the disruption story in the K-12 world.
I mean, one of the things, as you're talking about ESA, which is, not a technology, but a public policy, right?
Yeah.
But also COVID maybe sort of a forced non-consumption. So I know recently you talked to Brenda, right? I myself went and invested in a company which is around the microschool, and that seems to be growing. And maybe a non-consumption was sort of forced because the kids were staying at home and parents were seeing it as non-consumption.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think you're right. It's sort of the combination. The ESAs created a price value that was missing before. And then COVID created a non-consumption or also dissatisfaction. I think parents for the first time were like, wait, what the heck are you doing with my kids? And some of the screen time blowback at the moment, I also think is part of that because they were like, wait a minute, how many hours is my kid watching YouTube for? That's not active learning. That's not what I want. I think it's all part of it. You're right. Microschools are growing extremely rapidly at the moment. Is that the lift, I guess? I think it's possible as long as they're truly low cost in nature. I'm a little more skeptical of some of the micro schools that have come in at really high price points, of them somehow turning over the whole market.
That's a really good point. Maybe just a language around personalization, which started even at the Khan Academy. I'm not sure what the history, but with Fusion Academy, I send my grandson there and I absolutely love the model. You can do some back of the napkin calculation about the cost. And to me, it feels like while it is not delivered the low cost price point right now, but potentially it can be. That feels pretty exciting too.
Yeah, I think so. And for those that don't know, Fusion is sort of an ultra personalized model. And we have one near us for sure in Massachusetts. I think part of this is it's not going to be a one school model that overturns this, but it's probably a collection, right? It's like Primer meets Prenda, Open Ed, Fusion. Alpha probably has some role in this. It's like death by a thousand cuts. And I think we could get to a world in which in the future, there's maybe a series of scaled low cost micro schools. And then there's your mom and pops that are in the community. And then there's some percentage probably still in the public schools, I would imagine. And that's sort of your future of education. But I think it is families saying, just because I live here, I don't have to just take this option. I can assemble this. I think parents are starting to become more inquisitive and active in that process, which will be a good thing in terms of moving this forward.
Right. One of the things which I want the listeners to actually hear about, that when I was talking to you over email, so you made a point that the disruption theory, it was not about tech. And I tended to think about tech because I happened to be in the tech until Vocareum. And for us, it was pretty exciting because Moore's law, in a way a lot of people might not realize that, is actually provides steady pace and enabling sort of technology, which often does disrupt big stuff, right? The biggest disruption, of course, is the AI. All of a sudden, compute became available at a price point. You can do some crazy model training. But these things are already happening. But you made the point that disruption theory is not built around technology, but on disk drives and steel mills there's a technology enabler which is needed, but is that a fair way to describe the point you're making?
I think 100%. And in some ways, you're embarrassed when you read your old writings. I was reading some old blog. I found it from '09 or something like that, where I was like, could community colleges be the disruptive innovation in higher education? And you're like, actually not, because they don't have a technology enabler. So tech is certainly a key part of this, because you have to be able to come in with that primitive offering. And to your point of Moore's Law, it's got to improve at a trajectory, but without taking on all the cost and centralization of the thing that you're replacing. And so tech enabler is key. And I think it's that sort of game theory element of disruptive innovation. If we come in here with these unserved individuals, this group is going to be thrilled because they're like, well, we weren't serving them to begin with, and they're going to be happy to seed that part of the market. And then as they start to go up market and intrude, then you have a little asymmetric competition, if you will, that tends to favor the disruptive innovator. The classic story was the mini mills. When they came in, their profit margins always looked unattractive relative to the integrated mills at the time. And so they were happy to say, you do rebar, you do angle iron. We'll just seed that part of the market consistently and go to the higher value, our best customers. Of course, the danger of that is if you keep going up market to your best customers, at some point there are very few of those left.
Right. And I'm just actually refreshing the book again, the Disrupting Class, and one of the, Deck is a classic one, another one which, making a lot of money, doing great. They were a customer when I started it, but of course, we know what happened with the PCs.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, PCs. And the CEO famously said, who the heck wants a computer in their home? Well, 90+% of us, it turns out. So, yeah.
Right. So when I think about technology, and since I have been in the Silicon Valley, I think about PCs, and then it became mobile, internet, public cloud, and of course, AI now as kind of the broad, big sort of changes. But as far as education is concerned, feels like maybe it was first computers, and then online was supposed to be the enabler, and then now it's AI. I mean, is that fair that those are kind of the three vectors to look at as far as impact on at least the potential to disrupt education that was there?
I think that's right. Although I would just note that if you look back further over history, there's the chalkboard, I would argue, was the classic sustaining innovation for the classroom. But then when the radio and television came out, you definitely have prognosticators even then saying, we won't have to go to school anymore. Everyone will learn around their fireplace or whatever it was. So we have seen these predictions before: radio, TV, computer, internet, now AI. And I think the consistent thing that you could say over and over again is, where are the unserved? Where's the real sense that you're being overserved by the existing school system?
Right. So let's talk about higher ed, which feels like it's a more fertile market, right? Because unlike K-12, where there's no mandate, everybody has to go to school. And of course, higher ed is pretty interesting. Just in the last couple of weeks, I'm talking about AI. I'm sure you saw the Brown teacher saying that when you took students from take-home class to in-person class, the performance dropped. The U of Chicago, the law school, comes out with policy, right? Let's start with AI, actually, because I'm really curious about it. The talk is still AI at least causing a crisis, maybe not a disruption, which is people worrying about assessment, which is so embedded in the architecture of what schools do. And other is people worrying about cognitive offloading, right? Like the law schools. We know what the problem is, where do you think it's going?
I think the biggest issue at the moment, and this is what we got right actually in Disrupting Class, was that these problems of new technology, they almost always look like threats to the existing organizations because they upend their processes, their sense of identity, how they do things, and so forth. And it really does take new organizations, new business models, new institutions coming along that say, actually, that's not a detraction, that's actually a feature, right? I guess the line would be, it's not a bug, it's the benefit. And we haven't had that really yet. Western Governors University, obviously online competency-based university. We know that they're playing with an AI-native university. We know that UMass Global is launching an AI-native MBA program. Actually, they've launched it. It's $3,000 a kid. I think those places are having very different conversations around this because they're saying, okay, accept that that's going to happen in a world of zero-sum competition and take-home homework and so forth. What we're interested in is, how do you work alongside the AI to actually see what students are really doing and assess very differently and think about the work and sort of create a system in which students feel like they're cheating themselves if they outsource it all to AI. And I don't think the traditional academy has made that flip yet, right? It's still about which one of you is better than the other, which therefore, if that's the race, I'm just going to use AI to come up with the better looking performance. It's less of, hey, as a faculty member, I actually want every single one of you to master this, which does require you to do the hard work and figure it out. But the processes and systems have to then therefore look very different inside of an institution. And I frankly think it's going to be a few years until traditional institutions can even really absorb that conversation meaningfully. There's certainly leaders at institutions, Ohio State, Purdue, USC, and elsewhere, that I think are thinking more like this, but I think it's really hard to turn around these Titanics of operations.
Yeah, I have huge empathy for this, right? Most of our universities, you can rank by how old they are. So there is actually a little bit more interesting experiments happening. But going back to the architecture, because as an employer, I worry about two things. Few months ago, I used to worry about whether people can use AI effectively or not. And that has changed. Now, when I'm thinking about hiring people, I have two concerns, right? One is people experts enough in their domain that they know when to use the AI, how to use the AI. And second thing, of course, I worry about whether they know how to use the AI effectively. And if I had to pick one of them, I would say we'll teach about the AI, but the whole deep foundational domain knowledge, which you learn through the years of schooling, that is much harder. So I'm in favor of whatever law school saying that they need to make sure that certain classes, you can't use AI. Seems like at least today, that's the only answer. But I do want to talk about the UMass, right? I actually am not unfamiliar with it. What are they doing with the AI-native university? How does it work?
Yeah, first, let me just say, I couldn't agree more with you. So let me put that out there on the record. I think for novice learners, don't use AI unless it's a teaching tool. And that's how UMass Global is using it, which is, as I understand it, it's one faculty member for the entire MBA program for 50 students, with AI doing most of the teaching and mediating and assessing itself and giving feedback. And my assumption is that they really spent time training it on the curricular materials so that its answers limited to some degree by the material, I would imagine. I haven't seen it up close, but I think that's how they're using it. And my guess is that it's dialogic, but I don't know that. But that it's a conversation with the students, and you could use an outside AI to do the work. But then when you're having the conversation in real time with the AI, it's going to pick up either you don't know it or you're pausing to use something else. And so I think that's how they've done it, but that's an open question. I'm assuming there's a lot of group work as well around real world projects and delivery for folks, but I don't know that point exactly either. If I were doing something, I would do very little AI while you're doing that deep foundational knowledge that you described. And then as you were doing projects, I would say, please use the AI to do even deeper work, right? So that I can see you can do the combination of the two.
Right. That totally makes sense. On your point about WGU, at least I don't completely know, but one thing which was exciting to see, can you use AI again to go after the unserved market, you increase the funnel even more to people who can be brought in to the curriculums. I don't know whether I got an opportunity to mention to you, but we did a 2-year-long project with Vocareum at UCSD, where we are solely focused on developmental math. I'm assuming you have been following through this whole crisis that UCs have.
Yeah, on the math. And UCSD was the poster child. Yeah.
So UCSD knew it was going to happen. So they brought us in to say, hey, we have been doing some research, but we need to make sure that it get productized. So can you work with us? And that was pretty exciting. So we finally ended up publishing. The report says that taking into account for all the variables of the students who are coming in and the teacher and all that, the failure rate dropped by 2/3. So 70% fewer students were failing. And the key thing was AI. But the discovery for them was that AI did not make the outcome better, but what made the outcome better was practice. If you practice more, you did better, regardless of where you started. But what AI did was, for some learners, it just reduced the barrier for them to practice. It's pretty fascinating, So we are trying to scale this up.
Right? Yeah, the line goes, he who does the work does the learning. And there's, unfortunately, this thing in education against, they call it drill and kill. But I don't know any field in which you can become an expert without practicing. And so you do need your reps at some point.
Right. So again, the architecture for this one was Monday, you got an homework with AI. Wednesday, the AI got taken away. And Friday, you have to do a test without AI. So that sort of solved the problem of saying, hey, if you remove AI, then the performance drops.
Are you really going to do the work to learn this thing?
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think, going back to the higher ed and the workforce, what's your view of going back at the last 20 years about what disruption in the higher ed, any other sort of vectors like WGU, SNHU, you talked about just getting to people at scale?
Yeah, I think those have been the clearest disruptors in the higher ed market. They've been sort of classic in some ways. And now with the demographic decline of traditional 18-year-olds, I think we're about to see them really eat up. A combination of all these factors, we're going to see a lot of colleges closing. It's already started, frankly, but it's going to accelerate over the next several years. But I think for other institutions, they're going to have to think about first, go back to what's our purpose, right? How do we design around that? Really what you did with UCSD, I think that's a great model. People are going to have to sort of department by department, domain by domain, go back to those first principles and say, this is not a technology problem first and foremost. It's a problem of design. And then how do we use the technology to accelerate where appropriate and take it away where it's actually interfering with the actual work itself? And so that's what's required. The other thing I would say, what's not certain, I think there'll be a lot more entrants coming into the higher ed market powered by AI. The nut you have to crack, it turns out, is not technology, it's student acquisition costs, right? You got to get it low enough relative to the cost of delivery and the price that you charge. And that's where I've seen most possible disruptions, frankly, fail. I think coding boot camps, when we first met, they were fascinating, got off to a great start, but it turned out if your model was to throw people out in the wild every 3 months, you had to recruit a lot more to build up over time, and that becomes really hard. And so maybe the biggest secret, I would argue, to Western Governors University's success is that whereas the online learning market has gotten more expensive to acquire students every single year, Western Governors' costs to acquire students have actually gone down every single year. And I think it's because of referral. I think roughly 50% of their students are referred from past graduates of the program, which is actually the best way to hear about a program. Someone saying, this was a great deal. This is what it did for me in my career. So my instinct is any disruptors that come along to really crack the nut, they're going to probably have to have that similar thing where you get real endorsers out there in the market helping send students to you at no cost because you're doing such a good job of delivering value.
Yeah, and for WGUs, like my own stepkids have gone there and they are working, and you say, I need to get some classes done so I can take my nursing certification. I mean, there's nothing better, right?
And it's a no-brainer, right? Yeah. For those of us close to it, I think that's the thing. It's almost a purpose brand, right? You're working and you need this. Well, clearly that's going to be the answer. Right. It's almost like I'm going to go Google that, right? Or when you become that in an industry, then things become, I won't say easier, but they start to roll downhill a little bit for you.
Yeah, making a great point about acquisition cost. And I've seen the same thing, right? Even the large universities, they want to launch an online program. And I think there's such a geographical bias, like half the students come from within your geography. So it's like, even with the really, really strong brands, how do you lower the cost if you're just a new entrant? It's really unsolved problem. Yeah.
It's really hard. And to your point, I think it's 60% roughly of students enroll within 50 miles of where they live even today. And that's true in the online market, right? And so to your point, if Penn State launches an online program, they're going to get considerable numbers for two reasons. One, the brand name is so big, but two, if you graduate from Penn State, you all of a sudden are part of this alumni base, which largely lives and works around Pennsylvania. And that's an enormous asset because the job market is still a who you know market, and probably even more so now today because of AI. And who you connect with and associate with is a big deal. And so Western Governors, Southern New Hampshire's, Arizona States, those are sort of the exception that have been able to figure out how to go national and build networks. Most people have been stuck because labor markets are still regional in nature for the most part. I will say, I think there's this other part of it, and you've seen it in other markets, right? Which is as disruption occurs, it sort of hollows out the middle of the market, and there's a lot of consolidation at the top, and some of those players do go for scale for quite a while. And so I kind of wonder, NYU, Vanderbilt, Arizona State, Northeastern, right? These are becoming worldwide universities with campuses in multiple countries. And I think part of it is that they're realizing that the market has gotten so big globally that they can expand significantly and still be selective, if you will. And so might as well go for bigger market share. But also, if you're Vanderbilt, your market only being Nashville, Tennessee, Nashville is a wonderful city, but it's not going to provide jobs for someone who wants to be in India. And so starting to open up campuses in different countries, cities, et cetera, becomes core to that strategy is sort of my hypothesis. But it's something I've been really interested in, these brands taking their US position and going global with them. It's really
is it like Nike's? Does it travel? I guess you'll find out, right? Yeah. And I think it does, but we'll see. We didn't talk about the workforce learning. Any thoughts on what has disrupted and what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, well, you know this market well, right? I think there's been a lot of disruption in terms of traditional trainings that were delivered in person, like the plural sites of the world, or frankly, YouTube and all these tools, or even GitHub, that have allowed technical people in particular, but not exclusively, to constantly be reskilling and upskilling in their jobs and bring a lot of people in. I think it's hard because there wasn't an obvious at-scale player before delivering that sort of workforce learning. The thing that we're not sure about yet is, will there be some sort of apprenticeship model that goes global, right, that upends that? Multiverse looked like it might be, and then they came to the United States that can't spell apprenticeship if you spotted them the APP, and sort of got tripped up by it, right? But then here comes Reach University, new university, with apprenticeship degrees in teaching and now allied health professions and healthcare, and they're growing significantly fast. I mean, there's several thousand students already. Could that be something that sort of sits in between higher ed and workforce entry? I think that's something to watch. I guess the last thing I would say is, in some ways, AI created simulations, just frankly having ChatGPT alongside you as you're doing your work as a tutor, those may upend a little bit what we think of around all this. And so that's something to pay attention to as well. But certainly there have been a lot of companies that have come into that space and become pretty big pretty quickly.
Yes, you're talking about Reach. I know a lot of people, even I was not that familiar with it until pretty recently. That sounds really interesting. Do you want to describe for people who don't know? I mean, I know you are sort of involved with them, right?
Loosely, not officially in any way.
Okay,
I just friendly with them. Yeah, but I find them fascinating, probably the same way you do. They basically say they started with schools, and rural schools in particular, that had shortages of teachers. And they said, well, you have paraprofessionals and people who probably work in the lunch line or whatever else who are really good with kids and show promise, but they can't leave. They can't quit and enroll in a teacher's college to get their teaching license because it's too expensive. And even online school or night school, maybe it's like an 8-year proposition. That's not going to work. But they said, what if we sort of flip the model where when they're actually employed by the school district, and you could pick the ones that have the most promise that you want to enroll in this program, you keep paying them as an employee, like an apprentice, but now their work, start to put them in different settings that would correspond to the courses you'd have to take for teacher education. And at night, they'll hop online for an hour and a half to do the theoretical basis of teaching with a cohort. And that way they'll earn their teaching degree. So it's like the homework, if you will, is the employed time. It's the practicum time.
That's
when you're in a classroom and you're getting the online learning for the liberal arts and the theory basis of education. And as a result, they've completely made the cost of this essentially free to the students, no loans required. And they've taken away the opportunity cost because you're able to continue to work while you're getting that degree, and your work experience counts for credit effectively as the homework part of your degree. And now they're moving into healthcare, as I said. And so I agree. It's a fascinating model. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but I want to say it's like 4,000 students or something like that. And so Western Governors is the biggest teacher preparation program in the country. They're probably second or third already. So it's quite interesting. I agree.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Vocareum was started with, it's called vocation in the name, because that's the model I was really hoping that, can you get paid to actually learn? Never quite got there, but I'm glad to see that someone actually being able to pull it off.
I mentioned plural sites and the Simply Learns and folks like that have gone one path. I think what's so different about Reach is that they are still playing through the accreditation system. And there's a ton of jobs out there that are gated by licensure requirements at the state level. We could debate whether those are good requirements. I think in many cases, I just learned florists have to be licensed in Louisiana. I'm not sure that's a good use of anyone's time. As a result, you have to sort of navigate this policy regulatory environment to even be able to get in the game to get students for the credentials. And Reach was willing and able to do that. But I think that's hard. And that's been a very high barrier to entry that I hope comes down in the years ahead so that many more people like you could get their start, but actually acquire students much more easily than has been the case.
Yeah, I agree with accreditation. So just going back to my grandson, then we had a choice. The fact that Fusion was saying that they were accredited it took a lot of risk off when we were considering it. So I totally see the point.
Yeah. And I wish it didn't because I'm not sure the value, but it is the way the market works. People are suspicious when they don't see it.
Right. So, Michael, we're getting toward the end of the podcast. Anything you want to predict about any disruption in the future or any final thoughts for the listeners?
I guess I'll say a couple things. Clay and I famously predicted in 2012 that a quarter of colleges would close or merge. We're already at over 15% since then. I think it's going to probably be over 25% when you fast forward another 10 years from now. We've taken a deep dive lately with Steve Schulman looking at the finances, and that'll be a big thing. The second thing that's going to happen is at least one, maybe a couple more accreditors will get approved by the Department of Education in the next couple of years. If that happens, then it could lower the barriers to entry in higher education, which could increase disruptive innovation there. I think that would be a great thing. And then I guess the third thing I would say is if there's more states that jump into education savings accounts and they don't put up requirements like accreditation and they allow families to decide how to use the dollars, they're much looser on that. I think we'll see potential for more growth and disruptive innovation there as well. And then the very last thing, this workforce learning piece, I think the biggest thing that's going to be important in the years ahead as AI remakes what work looks like is much more experiential learning. I fully agree with you. Got to build domain expertise to be able to do this work. But in some cases, we're not going to know what that domain expertise really looks like. And so deep real world experience through projects, simulations, and stuff like that is going to become much more valued. Only place I think you're going to be able to get that experience is through education institutions. Because if I'm an employer, I don't know that I want to provide it. And so I'm going to be looking to the schools around me that do really good partnerships and experiential learning opportunities.
Thank you, Michael. This was great talking to you and really appreciate your time.
I appreciate everything you do. Thanks so much, Sanjay.
Thank you.